In a high-stakes congressional showdown watched by millions, Jim Jordan slams big tech for silencing truth, calling it the death of free speech. But across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett rises not with outrage, but with evidence. As shocking emails, leaked messages, and unreleased footage flood the hearing, the narrative twists. The man decrying censorship may have been quietly orchestrating it. Voices rise, reputations crack, and the line between protector and manipulator begins to blur. When power hides behind the mask of principle, who's really being silenced? And who's pulling the strings? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber crackled with tension before a single word was spoken. This wasn't just another congressional session. It was a powder keg primed to detonate. At the center, Jim Jordan gripped the gavel like it was a weapon, his face tight with indignation, eyes scanning the room as though daring anyone to challenge him. He slammed the gavel down once, hard, and the room jolted. "We are living in a digital dictatorship," he declared, his voice sharp, raw, and righteous. "Americans are being silenced by algorithms, shadow banned for their beliefs, erased by tech elites with no accountability." His supporters nodded vigorously. The phrase shadow banned bounced from wall to wall like a battle cry. The hearing was officially titled "The Role of Government in Oversight of Big Tech." But Jordan made it clear. He saw himself not as a moderator, but as a soldier in a war. Behind him loomed posters showing redacted tweets and headlines like "YouTube censors, conservatives again." And seated across the aisle, silent for now, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Democrat, lawyer, and the only one in the room who wasn't flinching. She was there as the lead Democrat, the voice of the minority, but her silence for now was deliberate, calculated, and soon it would become devastating. But Jordan wasn't finished. He had come to war, not a hearing, and now his voice cut through the room like a blade slicing clean through the veneer of civility. He rose slightly from his chair, arms spread wide as if to embrace the rage simmering across the room. "Let me make this clear," he began, his tone controlled but laced with venom. "Big tech doesn't just dislike conservative voices. They erase them. Deliberately, systematically, repeatedly." He held up a stack of papers, printouts of tweets, YouTube stills, redacted posts, all circled in red ink like the evidence of a crime scene. "Here," he said, snapping a page in the air, "is a tweet by a decorated Marine veteran questioning the 2020 election process. Flagged as false information, within 20 minutes he tossed it to the side like it was already contaminated. Here," he continued, holding up another image, "is a clip from Tucker Carlson, raising concerns about mRNA side effects. YouTube removed it. Within hours he threw that one down too, as if expecting someone to catch it and recoil. This isn't moderation," he spat. "This is purging. This is ideological cleansing of the digital public square." The tension in the room thickened like fog rolling in from a battlefield. The Republicans flanking him nodded with fervor, some muttering, "Damn right," others holding up their own folders like shields of solidarity. Jordan was in rhythm now, each sentence sharper than the last, and with every passing second, the air around him seemed to pulse with righteous fury. "We now live in a nation," he growled, "where bureaucrats in Silicon Valley sit in judgment over the voices of our citizens, where truth is no longer a matter of evidence, but of alignment with elite consensus. What happened to America? What happened to disagreement? What happened to the idea that you, the people, can think for yourselves?" He leaned forward, knuckles white against the wood of the desk, his voice tightening. "Let me tell you what's going to happen next," he said. "Today, this committee will issue subpoenas. Formal, binding, non-negotiable. Meta, Google, Twitter, all of them." His words struck like gunshots, deliberate and final. "We will demand the internal documents, the emails, the code that tells their algorithms to silence dissent. We will expose every flag, every filter, every biased decision dressed up as community guidelines." He paused, scanning the room. His gaze swept across the press gallery, where reporters scribbled frantically, and down to the cameras broadcasting his words live to millions. "They've hidden for too long behind the phrase, private company. Well, guess what?" His voice dropped an octave. When you control the national conversation, you answer to the public. The silence that followed was charged, radioactive even. Then a burst of applause erupted from the far right section of the room. It wasn't polite or restrained. It was explosive, visceral, like a rally cry igniting beneath the marble dome. A few aides stood up. Some banged their fists on the table. And as the noise surged, the cameras pivoted again. They found her, Jasmine Crockett, seated calmly, centered in frame, a single hand resting on a red folder like it was made of dynamite. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't rise to speak. Not yet. She simply sat there, lips pressed in a line so steady it looked carved in stone as the storm around her raged. She wasn't here to match his fury. She was here to dismantle it, line by line, fact by fact. Beneath the desk, her thumb tapped the folder once, not out of nerves, out of rhythm, a tempo she'd been rehearsing quietly, patiently, as the man across from her lit matches without realizing she held the fuse. Jordan had the room, for now, but Jasmine had something far more powerful. Silence with purpose. Silence that watched. Silence that remembered. And in her silence, the echo of truth was beginning to form. Slow, steady, inevitable. The camera lingered just long enough to catch the shift, a slight narrowing of her eyes, the subtle raise of one brow, and the realization, felt more than spoken, that when she did speak, it would not be to argue. It would be to expose. And then, like the shift in air before a pressure drop, like a hush that signals a coming reckoning, she moved. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't bang the table or call for order. She simply leaned forward, her palms flat against the oak, as though steadying the very weight of the truth she was about to unload. The red folder sat open now, its contents precisely arranged, but untouched. What she needed wasn't in the paper. It was in the silence Jordan had filled with bluster. Her tone was measured, calm, but each word hit with the density of controlled detonation. "Congressman Jordan," she began, "you invoke freedom of speech like it's a shield against accountability. But freedom is not the right to say anything without consequence, especially not when what's being said is deadly." Her voice didn't waver, but it didn't soar either. It cut clean and cold. "Free speech doesn't cover shouting fire in a crowded theater," she said, "and it damn sure doesn't protect broadcasting lies that send people to emergency rooms." She paused just long enough to let the room recalibrate. No one dared interrupt. "Let's talk about facts," she continued, reaching slowly into her folder and retrieving a single page, an enlarged screenshot, time-stamped, preserved like evidence in a criminal trial. This post went viral in August 2021, claiming that ivermectin, livestock dewormer, could cure COVID-19. No citations, no science, just fear, desperation, and misinformation. She held it aloft, not like a prop, but like an indictment. And it was shared, amplified, twice, from an account you publicly endorsed. Her eyes never left his face. You gave it legitimacy. You gave it reach. And someone out there, a mother of 3 in Lubbock, Texas, believed it. She tapped the paper gently. Her name was Melissa Graves, 38 years old. No pre-existing conditions, but she trusted that post. She trusted what it represented. She trusted you. Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. It thickened, not with anger, but with restrained grief. She took the dosage the post recommended, calculated by horse weight. She began vomiting blood within hours. By the time paramedics arrived, her organs were failing. She was unconscious. She never woke up. There were no gasps, no camera clicks. Just stillness, like the hearing had slipped into a different dimension, one where noise couldn't coexist with truth. Her husband, James, tried to sue the manufacturer, but the company never made those claims. The Post did. The Post that your office chose to circulate as just asking questions. Jasmine placed the page gently onto the stack, as if laying a flower at a grave, and then she dropped the line like a gavel cracking marble. "So I ask you, Congressman Jordan, do you want to protect free speech, or do you want to protect the right to lie without consequence?" Her voice didn't rise. It fell like a whisper that somehow drowned out every thought in the room. Because there's a difference, she said, and if you can't tell where the line is, you have no business standing on the platform that broadcasts to millions. Jordan shifted in his seat. He tried to smirk, but it landed wrong. Strained, cornered, exposed. He gave a low chuckle, dry and performative, as if to suggest her words hadn't landed. But they had. They had detonated with surgical precision. Crockett didn't react. She didn't need to. She had taken a moment that had been dominated by anger and volume and replaced it with something far more powerful, a quiet, devastating confrontation with truth. And the room, still as stone, seemed to know that the balance had shifted, permanently. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's question was brief, but it wasn't hollow. It was thick, heavy, like the kind of pause that hangs just before a defendant decides how much of the truth he's willing to surrender. Jim Jordan adjusted his microphone slowly, almost theatrically, as if the world needed a beat to prepare for his rebuttal. His face tightened, but not in confusion, in calculation. Then came the scoff, sharp and dry, followed by a low, dismissive chuckle that seemed designed to mock the very premise of what had just been said. He leaned forward, elbows planted, and spoke into the mic with a voice sharpened by practiced defiance. "Let me make something perfectly clear," he said, drawing each word out like it was armor being strapped into place. "I have never contacted Meta, or Twitter, or YouTube. Not to take anything down, not to silence anyone, not for political gain. Period." He glanced around the chamber, letting his eyes lock momentarily with allies who gave him small nods of reassurance, like quiet endorsements of a creed they had rehearsed. "I'm not the puppeteer behind some grand censorship scheme," he continued, hands spread wide in a gesture of clean conscience. "I'm not the one calling for bans or blacklists or content moderation protocols. I don't even like those terms." He jabbed the air with two fingers. "You want to know who's being silenced in this country?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Me." His tone dropped, like a confession spoken too close to a flame. "I'm the one who's had posts flagged. I'm the one who's had interviews demonetized. I'm the one who's been shadow banned, blackballed, and buried under algorithmic bias for speaking uncomfortable truths." His voice began to rise now, not in volume, but in intensity, like a fire slowly fed oxygen. "Every time I post something that challenges the dominant narrative, whether about COVID origins, election integrity, or radical gender ideology, it's instantly throttled, hidden, or fact-checked by anonymous third parties no one elected, no one knows, and no one can hold accountable." He shook his head, more in disbelief than anger, though the line between the two was vanishing fast. "And you dare suggest I'm the one pulling the strings? That I'm somehow directing censorship when I've been fighting to speak at all?" He leaned in, shoulders forward, voice now clipped and deliberate. "Let me say this for the record. I'm not the man behind the curtain. I'm the guy they tried to pull the curtain over. I'm not giving orders. I'm fighting for oxygen." A quiet murmur passed through a few corners of the room. Whispers, shuffled pages. The shifting weight of people unsure whether they were witnessing conviction or choreography. But Jordan didn't care. His jaw was set. His narrative was fixed. He had cast himself not as the wielder of power, but as its victim. "This isn't about me silencing others," he added, leaning back as if sealing his testimony with the posture of righteous fatigue. "This is about me being silenced, about millions of Americans who feel like their voices don't count because tech giants have decided they know what's best for us." His tone lowered to a near growl. "I'm not backing down from this. I'm not the problem. I'm the resistance." And with that, he folded his hands, as if daring anyone to challenge what he just painted. But if Jordan expected his declaration to end the exchange, he miscalculated, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished listening. She was waiting. She nodded once, slowly, deliberately. Not as a sign of agreement, but like a judge acknowledging a plea she already knew was hollow. Then came her voice, soft even, but now laced with voltage. A single sentence that cut through the theater of denial like a scalpel. "Then let's take a look at this email." The words were calm, but their weight shifted the room. Crockett didn't raise her tone. She didn't have to. What she had was evidence, and she delivered it not with fire, but with control. Her right hand moved with precision as she reached beneath the red folder, pulling out a crisp printed page. Its header bore the familiar blue and white letterhead of Twitter's legal team. She slid it across the desk slowly, as if revealing a card Jordan never thought she'd play. And in that moment, the silence wasn't empty. It was the sharp inhale of a room realizing the tide was turning. The air had not recovered from the first document, and Jasmine knew it never would. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the unraveling. With the same quiet control she had maintained from the start, she reached back into the red folder and extracted a second sheet. Thicker paper, congressional letterhead in crisp navy ink, the kind that carries weight not just in words but in status. She didn't hold it aloft like a trophy. She laid it flat, centered it with the same precision a surgeon gives to a scalpel, and looked up, directly at Jordan. Her voice was soft, but the silence it dropped into made it sound like thunder. "This one's personal," she said. "October 2021. You sent this yourself, to a senior executive at Twitter." She let the statement breathe before continuing. "It wasn't about false science or conspiracy theories. It wasn't about national security. It was about optics, about image." Her hand tapped the paper once, specifically a post criticizing the Trump family. And in your own words, direct quote, "This kind of narrative endangers national unity. We need it gone." The room stiffened. Chairs creaked under shifting bodies. Even some on Jordan's side couldn't mask the flicker of discomfort that passed over their faces. The phrasing was unmistakable, cold, instructive, commanding. "Gone," she repeated, eyes locked on him. "Not challenged, not answered. Gone." The lights above seemed suddenly too bright, the microphones too sensitive. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. "You weren't defending the First Amendment, Congressman. You were protecting the First Family. And you did it by leaning directly on a private platform to erase criticism." Her voice didn't rise, it tightened. "That is not the posture of someone being silenced. That is the action of someone issuing the silence." Jordan bristled, his face flushed, jaw clenching as he reached for the mic like a drowning man for a ledge. "That's a distortion," he said, tone rising with brittle urgency. "That wasn't a command. It was a concern, a national concern." His hand motioned to the document, palm open in protest. "I was warning them that kind of rhetoric, attacking a president's family during a crisis, could cause more division. That's not an order to take it down. That's a call for responsibility." The words stumbled out, each one struggling to find footing. "You're twisting it," he added, but the tension in his voice betrayed the truth. The words weren't twisting, they were his. They had his seal, his date, his signature. And across the table, Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her fingers resting lightly on the page, the room watching not a moment of conflict, but of collapse. She had shown the one thing spin couldn't drown, a paper trail with intent, clarity, and consequence. And Jordan, for all his noise, was now arguing with ink. The silence following Jordan's protest wasn't accidental. It was earned. But Jasmine Crockett didn't allow it to linger out of mercy. She let it hang just long enough to expose the fragility beneath his words, the hollow echo of someone scrambling to separate intent from consequence. And then she moved, leaning in slightly, as if what she was about to say didn't need to travel far to hit its mark. Her voice was low, deliberate, and unwavering, the tone not of confrontation, but of finality. "You don't have to give a direct order, Congressman," she said, each word precisely measured, her gaze locked and unwavering. "Because when someone with your platform, your committee chair, your political reach sends a message like that, 'We need it gone,' it's not a request. It's pressure in its most recognizable form." Her fingers, steady and poised, rested on the email as if sealing it into the congressional record. "You know what your name means when it appears in the inbox of a corporate executive. You know what it implies, what it demands without saying it out loud." Her tone sharpened like a blade being drawn slowly across stone. "You didn't have to shout. You didn't have to threaten. Because the weight of your office did the work for you." The temperature in the room dropped, not from the air, but from the collective realization that this wasn't conjecture. It was strategy, intentional silence draped across authority. Jasmine's voice held steady as she reached for another sheet. A digital platform compliance log, time-stamped and sourced. This post, criticizing the Trump family's use of COVID funds, was live for months without incident, she said. But within 2 hours of your email, it was gone. Removed, not flagged, not corrected, eliminated. She laid the printout on the desk next to the first like a puzzle piece clicking into place. And the account that posted it? Suspended. No warning, no appeal. Their entire thread vanished into algorithmic blackness. She didn't need to raise her voice. The data spoke louder than outrage. This is not about whether the post was tasteful, she continued, her voice now colder, more refined. It's about whether someone with power can erase inconvenient voices by cloaking coercion as concern for unity. She paused, not for effect, but to let the truth complete its descent. You didn't send a suggestion, Congressman. You sent a signal, and it was heard. She looked across the dais, her posture unwavering, her delivery calm but irreversible. Your words carried weight you refused to acknowledge, she said, but the timeline doesn't lie. The silence that followed your message didn't emerge by accident. It was engineered. And as the echo of her final word faded, the room sat frozen in the certainty that power had not just been exposed, but weaponized. The fallout from the documents had left the room on edge, tense, breathless. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. Not with words, not with paper. What came next wasn't printed ink or legislative jargon. It was a human voice, walking in from the shadows with something far more dangerous than opinion. Lived knowledge. The door at the side of the chamber clicked open, and all eyes turned. A man in a charcoal suit, no tie, shoulders squared with quiet defiance, stepped forward. There was no press release, no preamble, just a nameplate set before him by an aide. Evan Marlowe, former director of Election Integrity Response, Twitter. The name sent a visible stir through the Republican side of the committee. Cameras whirred to refocus. Marlowe adjusted the microphone and looked toward the chair for a nod. He received it. Then, with a voice that didn't shake but held the gravity of someone who had carried this weight for too long, he spoke. For 3 years, I was responsible for leading Twitter's internal misinformation mitigation, especially during the 2020 and 2022 election cycles. I worked with representatives from both parties, most of them transparent and professional. He let that sentence breathe before delivering the one that broke the air in half. But no elected official reached out more often, more indirectly, and with more implicit demands than Congressman Jim Jordan. The room stilled, not with surprise, but with the chilling certainty of something long suspected finally spoken aloud. Marlowe reached into his briefcase and produced a sealed folder. He slid it across the table with surgical precision. Inside, he said, are screenshots of direct communications, emails from unofficial addresses, signal messages that were never logged through official oversight channels, and internal logs noting his repeated attempts to influence our moderation queue. He opened the folder and withdrew the top page, a high-resolution screenshot. In the corner, the sender ID, JJ. The message, you need to kill this thread before it spirals. Eyes are on it already. Time-stamped precisely 41 minutes before the flag post was removed. Marlowe continued, his tone steady but merciless. This wasn't a one-time thing. We saw a pattern, strategic nudges couched as suggestions, loaded phrases like, quiet this down, or flag it higher up the chain. Always vague, always deniable, but always effective. He lifted another sheet, another signal capture. Too much heat on this one. Quiet it down. Same cadence, same pressure, same outcome. Content removed, account throttled, no trace of public process. I'm submitting these messages into the record, Marlowe said, his hand never shaking, because it's time the American public understands that behind the curtain of public outrage about censorship is the quiet, precise choreography of political power, ensuring only certain truths survive. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of what he said settled over the room like concrete. And for once, Jim Jordan had no line, no defense, no fire to hurl back. Only the slow realization that the narrative he'd built was now collapsing under the proof of his own fingerprints. The moment felt like a courtroom on the verge of eruption, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't in a rush. She knew the sharpest blows don't land in chaos, they land in silence. The screen behind her glowed with the unmistakable image of a signal conversation. High resolution, unedited, and authenticated by a digital chain of custody that had just been submitted into the congressional record. Jasmine didn't glance at the audience. Her eyes were fixed on the words, ugly in their brevity, damning in their precision. In the upper left corner, the initials were all that was needed, JJ. The timestamp, November 2nd, 2022, 9:41 p.m. The message, can we just nuke these threads? It's bad timing. Not a request for clarification, not a call for facts. A command, dressed in casual language, but no less weaponized. Crockett's fingers curled lightly around the page as she read it aloud, her voice even, each syllable delivered like a scalpel tracing a scar. Can we just nuke these threads? It's bad timing. The room tensed, a low rustle of shifting bodies responding to something too blunt to misinterpret. She lowered the page and turned toward Jordan. Not rushing, not gloating. Her tone was composed, cool and surgical, like someone done asking questions and ready to deliver a diagnosis. So this is what it looks like, she said softly. This is what happens when power wraps itself in denial and still leaves fingerprints all over the trigger. Her eyes locked on his. You weren't opposing censorship, Congressman. You were orchestrating it, not to protect the public, but to protect yourself. The lights seemed to dim just slightly, or maybe it was the weight of the accusation pulling everything toward it. This wasn't about free speech, she continued, her voice growing colder, sharper. This was about silencing speech, selectively, strategically, and only when it threatened the narrative that served you. She stepped back, letting the gravity of the message root itself into the room. You didn't just want to control what was seen, she added, quieter now but no less cutting. You wanted to decide when truth was too inconvenient to survive. Behind her, the signal message still burned on the screen, its 9 words glowing like a confession etched in glass. And across from her, Jim Jordan sat motionless, stripped of plausible denial, face caught between defiance and exposure. Because no matter what he said next, the room had already seen what mattered. And this time, the silence belonged to her. The silence that followed Jasmine's last words was not empty. It was dense, magnetic, crushing in its stillness. It pressed on Jim Jordan's chest like a weight he hadn't prepared for. And under that pressure, something cracked. Not in the room, but in him. His composure faltered. He leaned forward too quickly, the movement jerky, uncalculated, like someone grabbing at a ledge in the dark. I don't remember those messages, he stammered, his voice no longer carrying the edge of authority, but the thrum of panic. His eyes searched the room, not with the confidence of a man trying to lead, but the desperation of one trying not to fall. Those weren't official communications, he said, louder now, almost forcing the words out. Signals encrypted. It's used by journalists, lawmakers, everyone in this room. He gestured broadly, hoping to drag others into his defense. I use it for security, for confidentiality, for privacy, and that is not a crime. The last sentence cracked under its own weight, more shouted than said, more defensive than convincing. He straightened slightly, eyes darting toward the chairman, hoping for a procedural interruption that never came. We all have a right to protect our conversations, he continued, trying to steady his voice. But each word came out thinner, more strained. Privacy is foundational to democracy, isn't it? He reached for principle now, hoping to wrap himself in its fabric before the truth finished stripping him bare. But the tremor in his tone betrayed him. This wasn't about principle. It was about exposure. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She let the echo of his words dissolve into the walls. Then she moved, not quickly but deliberately, her gaze fixed on him like a surgeon preparing for the final incision. Her voice was cold, precise, and unshakably clear. Privacy, she said, her tone low enough to make the entire room lean in. You're hiding behind privacy now? She let the accusation hang for half a second, just enough to cut through the fog of his deflection. Privacy? To what end, Congressman? To protect national security? Or to hide the truth you tried to erase? Each word struck with surgical weight, not shouting over him, but slicing beneath him, exposing what he hoped would remain in shadow. She didn't need a second question. She didn't need to raise her voice, because in that moment, the room understood something fundamental. Jim Jordan hadn't just used encrypted messages to protect communication. He had used them to conceal intent. And now that intent was no longer encrypted. It was in full view, and Jasmine Crockett was holding the key. The silence was now no longer just heavy. It was personal. And Jasmine Crockett was about to show the room why it had to be. She reached into her folder once more, not for a policy document, not for a screenshot, but for something far more intimate, far more devastating. The weight of what she held wasn't measured in legal arguments or digital footprints. It was measured in heartbeats. She took a breath, slower than before, like someone bracing for emotional impact. Then she looked up, her voice dropping into something quieter and heavier. "This," she said, lifting a page printed on the standard letterhead, "is an email sent to this very committee. It came from an emergency room physician in Dallas. And it's not theoretical. It's not abstract. It's what happens when the consequences of what we say leave this room and end up in the trauma bay." The room held still. Jasmine blinked once, then read. "I lost a patient this week." She paused. Her voice tightened, not with anger, but something worse, sorrow wrapped in restraint. A man in his early 40s, no comorbidities. He refused the vaccine because he believed a video circulating online, a clip shared and amplified by Congressman Jim Jordan. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She stayed steady, steadier than she had any right to be. "The email goes on," she said, glancing down briefly to anchor herself. "By the time he came in, his lungs were already gone. His wife said he wouldn't listen to anyone, not even her, because the congressman's clip said natural immunity was better and that the vaccine might kill him." She stopped again, this time visibly, her throat locked, her jaw set. The grief in the doctor's words was now hers. "They couldn't intubate him fast enough," she said. "He coded, right there, in front of his wife, in front of his daughter." There was no outrage in her voice now, just something stripped of political theater, something raw. Jasmine looked up again, this time slower, as if forcing herself to hold eye contact through the ache. "He's not here to testify," she said. "He's not here to talk about free speech, or platforms, or the First Amendment, because he's dead." Her fingers clenched the edge of the paper now, knuckles pale, holding it like a flag folded after a funeral. "And the lie that killed him didn't come from the dark web. It didn't come from a Russian bot. It came from here, from someone who holds power, who commands attention. Who knew better?" Jordan didn't move, didn't speak. His mouth was half open, but the words, if they existed, were buried beneath something thicker than denial. For a long, terrible second, the chamber just existed. No one shifted, no one interrupted. It wasn't a political debate anymore. It was a post-mortem. Then Jasmine spoke again, just once more. But when she did, her voice cracked, not out of weakness, but because she allowed it to. "You can call that freedom if you want," she said, eyes still locked on Jordan. "But I call it something else." She swallowed hard, barely getting the last two words out. "I call it complicity." The word landed like a closing door in a hospital hallway. Software final. Inescapable. Jasmine stepped back slightly, still holding the email, her breath tight, her eyes full. She didn't need applause. She didn't need agreement. She just needed the truth. This truth to be seen, felt, and remembered. And now it was. Not as a headline, not as a hashtag, but as a story no one could unhear. A life lost, a lie believed, and a man in power who had every chance to tell the truth and chose not to. The weight of Jasmine Crockett's final words still hung in the air, like smoke after a detonation. Complicity. A word that did not shout, but whispered with the power of judgment. The chamber was still recovering when the next wave hit. A digital technician seated near the clerk's bench quietly handed over a flash drive, unannounced, unassuming, but unmistakably important. Jasmine didn't even look at it as it was inserted into the hearing system. She already knew what it contained. On the central screen above the dais, the display flickered once, and then came to life with footage never before seen by the public. The room, already tense, leaned in collectively, eyes narrowing, posture sharpening. And then the audio began. It was grainy but clear enough. A recorded phone call between Congressman Jim Jordan and a senior executive at a national news outlet. The whistleblower, a former communications analyst within the media conglomerate, had released the clip under the protection of anonymity, but the voice in the audio? Unmistakably Jordan's. "I understand journalistic independence," the voice began, calm, measured, but beneath it, an unmistakable current of threat. "But this piece you're airing, the timing is wrong." There was a pause, a shuffle of paper, a distant exhale from the other end of the call. Then came the line that sent the oxygen from the chamber like a sudden vacuum. "This isn't the time to stir up doubt in our base." The room froze. The screens locked on Jordan's profile as the audio continued to roll, damning in its clarity. "We're months away from a crucial midterm. We can't afford fractures right now. I'm asking you to reconsider how hard you push this story. Maybe let it cool. Run something else in its place. Something unifying." Another pause, then, "This isn't suppression. It's strategy." The screen froze on the timestamp, October 3rd, 2022, 8:27 p.m., before cutting to black, and then the room detonated. Lawmakers on both sides erupted into noise. Shouts, gasps, overlapping accusations hurled across the dais like shrapnel. Reporters scrambled for their phones, heads turned in every direction. Microphones began to short from the sheer audio overload. The chairman of the committee slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in this chamber," he barked. "We will have order." But the gavel was no match for what had just been played. Jordan, meanwhile, remained frozen, caught in a stillness not of discipline, but of disbelief. He hadn't known it had been recorded. That much was evident. Jasmine didn't speak yet. She waited, watching, like someone watching a building lean too far before the collapse. When the room finally began to settle into a strained, brittle quiet, she stood, not slowly, but with precision, not for theater, for truth. Her voice came low, restrained, almost too calm for what had just unfolded. "That wasn't a political operative. That wasn't a party staffer. That was a member of Congress," she said, eyes never leaving Jordan. "And not just any member, a committee chair, a man entrusted with the oversight of our democratic institutions, asking a media outlet to bury an investigation because it might hurt his side." She let that sink, her hands folded in front of her, not in submission, but in restraint. "There are those in this chamber," she continued, "who talk endlessly about free speech, about censorship, about platforms that are too powerful. But the moment the truth becomes inconvenient, what do we hear?" She pointed to the screen now, blank. "We hear phrases like, 'This isn't suppression, it's strategy.'" She scoffed, not for effect, but because there was simply no other response. "What's next, Congressman? Are facts only patriotic when they serve your messaging?" Jordan opened his mouth, but there were no words waiting. His team huddled behind him, frantically flipping through folders, whispering strategies that no longer mattered. The room had heard him, his voice, his plea, not to correct misinformation, not to defend democracy, but to silence a story, strategically. Jasmine's voice turned colder now, like a scalpel freshly honed. "Do you want to know what makes this worse than hypocrisy?" she asked, her voice steady. "It's not that you tried to kill the truth. It's that you did it while branding yourself as the victim. You stood before this country, week after week, and told the American people that you were being silenced, that your voice was under attack." She paused only for a breath, but it hit like a thunderclap. "But all along, you were the one making the calls, giving the signals, pulling the strings." The room was so still now, it was as if everyone feared that even breathing too loud would break something sacred. The gravity of what had been exposed hung in the air, not like a scandal, but like a confession carved into stone. Jasmine folded her hands again and looked around. Not at the press, not at her fellow lawmakers, but at the people watching from home. "We can survive being wrong," she said. "What we cannot survive is power being used to bury the facts before the people even get to see them." She looked back at Jordan, eyes hard, voice quiet but sharpened to the bone. "So no, Congressman, you weren't protecting the country. You weren't guarding national unity. You were protecting yourself from scrutiny, from accountability, from the truth." She nodded toward the blank screen, where just moments earlier his voice had played for the world to hear. "And now that truth is no longer yours to control." Jordan remained still, lips parted but silent, as if his body hadn't yet caught up to the fact that something irreversible had just happened. Around him, allies shifted in their chairs, unsure whether to defend, retreat, or simply disappear. But Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for them to decide. Her message had been delivered, not shouted, not spun, just spoken, clearly, powerfully, and with the full force of evidence behind it. And this time, the silence that followed wasn't tension, it was consequence. The recording had ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than any gavel. The weight of what had just played still gripped the hearing room like a steel vice. Every breath seemed measured, every glance sharpened, with the awareness that something irreversible had just shifted. Jasmine Crockett remained standing, motionless, eyes never breaking from Jim Jordan, whose face was a storm of color and contradiction. He was no longer leaning forward in command, no longer guiding the narrative. He was cornered by his own voice, his own language, his own intent. And Jasmine wasn't finished. She took one slow step forward, not for effect, but for control. Her voice came low, deliberate, not raised, not strained, but with the kind of gravity that drops into a room and pulls everything into its orbit. "True freedom," she began, "does not require secrecy." Her tone didn't accuse, it revealed. "It does not demand back channels, encrypted chats, or off-the-record phone calls to suppress the public's right to know." She looked slowly around the room, sweeping across faces both startled and stilled. "Real liberty doesn't flinch under scrutiny. It doesn't vanish under timestamps or hide behind bad timing. It doesn't erase narratives. It survives them." Then she turned back to Jordan, this time with no folder in hand, no document between them, just truth, undeniable, unfolding. "You claim to be the champion of free speech," she said, voice razor steady. "But the only speech you seem to fight for is your own." She took another step, eyes never leaving his. "And the moment that speech stops serving you, when the truth doesn't tilt in your direction, you don't protect discourse. You bury it." A pause, waited, controlled. "You're not here because you were silenced," she added, quieter now. "You're here because for the first time, the silence didn't work." Jordan blinked, but his mouth didn't move. The blood had risen to his cheeks, a deep, pulsing flush that crept toward his temples. The cameras caught it in crystal clarity, a moment of power exposed to the light. Jasmine stood straight again, her next words delivered with a calm that could split stone. "You don't oppose censorship, Congressman. You fear it when it stops working for you." The sentence struck like a final nail driven with bare hands. No theatrics, just the sound of truth reverberating against power. She looked to the chairman, then to the committee at large, her tone shifting, not to rage but to procedure. And somehow that made it more devastating. Given the documented communications, the direct attempts to manipulate news coverage, and the abuse of personal influence over public platforms, she said clearly, "I formally propose the opening of an ethics investigation into Congressman Jordan's use of office to interfere with the independence of private media and public discourse." The chamber didn't erupt. It recoiled, quietly, like an animal that had just seen the shape of its predator too late. Murmurs fluttered, but no one shouted. No one laughed. The suggestion was too grounded, too supported, too real to dismiss. At the far end of the table, the chairman glanced down at his docket, but the cameras were no longer focused on him. They had found Jordan. The lens slowly zoomed inward. tight, unflinching, unsparing, as the congressman's face turned deeper shades of crimson. His jaw clenched. A bead of sweat had formed just beneath his right temple. He reached for a pen, then put it down. Reached again, put it down again. He wasn't under attack. He was under exposure. And no amount of partisan noise could muffle what had just been carved into the record. Jasmine remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She had said what she came to say, and what she said had pulled the mask clean off a man who had spent years building it, thread by thread. Now it was gone, and in its place was a silence far louder than applause. Because some victories don't need celebration. They just need to be heard. The chamber was still reeling from Jasmine Crockett's final blow. Her call for a formal ethics investigation had shifted the hearing from heated to historic. But outside the Capitol walls, another fire had already ignited, and it was spreading fast. The moment the footage of Jordan's phone call hit live broadcasts, the media machines responded with a speed that suggested they'd been waiting. Within minutes, major outlets began publishing what they had held back: documents, emails, internal memos. A dam of silence finally broken by the force of exposure. The first to strike was a piece from the Washington Post, headlined, "Pattern of Pressure, Jordan's Quiet Campaign to Control Conservative Media." Beneath it, screenshots emerged from 2021 emails to Fox News producers. Emails that bore the unmistakable tone of directive wrapped in suggestion. One line stood out like a siren. "That segment on vaccine safety, it's too alarmist. Can we find someone to refocus the angle?" Another, dated just days before a primetime special was mysteriously shelved, read, "We need to be careful not to fracture the base with unnecessary fear." It didn't stop there. CNN broke a concurrent report citing anonymous Fox staffers who recalled private phone calls from Jordan's office, warning them to tread carefully on segments that painted the Trump administration's pandemic response in a poor light. The irony was suffocating. The man who had spent years crying foul over alleged left-wing media censorship had, behind closed doors, played the role of editor-in-chief, not with facts, but with fear. And now that role was being replayed on every screen in America. NBC News aired a whistleblower audio clip, separate from the one introduced in the hearing, featuring a Fox News senior producer summarizing Jordan's tone in one of those calls. He didn't threaten, but the implication was clear. If we didn't ease off, we'd be hearing about it from every corner of the house. The clip ended with silence, not because there was nothing more to say, but because the point had been made. Jordan hadn't needed to control every word. He just had to create doubt about which words were safe. By the end of the afternoon, MSNBC and Reuters had joined in, publishing overlapping timelines that linked the sudden removal of several Fox News digital stories to the hours immediately following Jordan's off-the-record conversations. One particular expose focused on a deeply reported piece about government stockpiling of ventilators, which had been ready for release, and then abruptly shelved. The producer involved had reportedly received a call marked JJ Cell. The call lasted 4 minutes. The story was never published. Back inside the chamber, staffers were now being handed real-time updates from the outside world. Phones lit up with notifications like battlefield reports. Members of the press gallery were openly typing with trembling fingers, whispering to each other as the dam burst across their newsrooms. A Huffington Post headline blared, "The voice of censorship wasn't Silicon Valley. It was the halls of Congress." The Atlantic followed suit with a biting editorial, "Jim Jordan and the myth of the muzzled right." What made the revelations even more incendiary wasn't just what Jordan had done, it was what he claimed to stand against. He had made himself the poster child for speech under siege, the martyr of algorithmic oppression. But what now emerged was a man who had moved like a ghost through networks of influence, whispering not to protect discourse, but to steer it. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The outside world had taken up where she left off. The press had seen enough. The country had heard enough. And Jordan, still seated, hands clenched into the edge of the table, face red not with rage but with realization, was now the subject of something he couldn't shift, spin, or silence. He had lost control of the narrative, not because someone took it from him, but because the truth no longer needed permission to speak. And outside the hearing, the world was finally listening. The headlines were still spreading like wildfire, each new leak confirming what Jasmine Crockett had laid bare under oath. But even as the room reeled from the exposure of Jordan's back-channel influence over Fox News, another witness stepped forward, quietly but with a presence that sent a new kind of chill through the room. The committee clerk called the next name without flair: Daniel Reyes, former Content Strategy Liaison, YouTube Trust and Safety Division. He wore no suit, no tie, just a simple gray shirt, sleeves rolled, and eyes that had clearly watched far more than he was ever meant to speak of. As he approached the table, the sound of typing in the press gallery slowed, as if even the reporters sensed that something deeper was coming. Reyes took his seat, adjusted the mic with calm fingers, and looked up at the committee, not to grandstand, but to unburden. "I'm not here to make headlines," he began. "I'm here because I saw a pattern, a deliberate pattern." The chamber, already thick with tension, seemed to contract. He placed a slim stack of documents beside him: internal logs, flagged requests, archived communication chains. Between late 2020 and early 2023, our team received multiple informal inquiries from congressional offices, most of them vague, most of them non-binding. But one office in particular stood out because their timing was always exact. He paused, then said it clearly. Congressman Jim Jordan's team. Jasmine Crockett, still seated at the far end, didn't move. She didn't need to. The witness was painting the next stroke of a picture she had already begun. Reyes continued, voice steadier now, louder. "We called it the sweep because every time there was a major hearing involving Congressman Jordan, whether he was testifying, chairing, or simply in the spotlight, we'd get a back-channel request about content visibility." A gasp stirred from somewhere near the back row, but Reyes pressed forward, unshaken. Never official, never direct, but always targeted, always urgent. He flipped open one document, an internal tag summary. A week before his July 2022 Judiciary Committee appearance, we were asked to review several problematic uploads related to Jordan's early pandemic interviews. The list included videos that questioned his consistency on vaccine data, his shifting stance on mail-in ballots, and one clip of a former aide alleging he reversed his position on tech regulation. Reyes tapped the page. 3 days later, all but one had been manually reviewed, and 2 were downgraded in visibility. He looked up again, this time straight at the panel. None of the videos violated policy. None contained misinformation by our standards. But the pressure was real. The intent was real. He took a breath. He didn't just want the spotlight. He wanted the stage cleared before he stepped onto it. The power of that statement was immediate, not just because of what it said, but because of who was saying it. An insider, not a partisan, not a politician. Just someone who had been there when the curtain was pulled. Reyes leaned forward now, as if carrying something heavier than evidence. Memory. In the final message I saw, a Jordan staffer wrote, quote, "Let's make sure nothing inflammatory clouds the narrative this week. We're setting tone." He paused, then added, "I didn't realize elected officials were supposed to set tone by deleting the record." A hush fell again, this time not out of shock, but out of comprehension. Jordan wasn't just shaping the conversation. He had been scrubbing the terrain before it even began. And now every moment he had claimed victimhood, every televised cry about being canceled or shadow banned, cracked under the weight of what Reyes had just laid down. Reyes turned the final page and looked directly at Chairman Hudson, his voice neither angry nor afraid. This wasn't about freedom of speech. It was about freedom from scrutiny. The camera panned to Crockett for a brief second, but it was enough. Her expression didn't show victory. It showed something colder. Validation. Not a triumph born from conflict, but the clarity of a truth that had finally found its witness. As the room descended into uneasy silence, Reyes carefully stacked his documents and slid them forward. They didn't fall with a slam. They landed like a gavel. The committee was no longer questioning big tech. It was questioning Jim Jordan. The air outside the Capitol had changed. Hours after the hearing's explosive close, as dusk settled like a bruise over Washington, the first headlines began to thunder. Jordan's war on truth backfires, blared the New York Times. Leaked emails reveal double standard on censorship, declared CNN. But it wasn't just the usual outlets. Even conservative giants like the Daily Wire were no longer standing guard. Their language softened, their tone uncertain. Representative Jordan's stance faces scrutiny after hearing Firestorm. Clips from the hearing had already gone viral. On TikTok, millions watched Jasmine Crockett, poised like a slow-moving firestorm, drop the damning signal messages. On YouTube, the moment she read aloud the email, "This narrative endangers national unity. We need it gone," hit trending #1 within hours. But more than the quotes, it was the silence that haunted viewers. The cut to Jordan's face, pale and drawn. The flicker in his eyes as Crockett pressed. "You don't oppose censorship. You fear losing control over who gets to wield it." The backlash didn't wait. Civil liberties groups, once praising Jordan for defending speech, began issuing cautious statements. The ACLU, in a midnight press release, wrote, "Free speech demands consistency. Selective enforcement is not freedom, it's manipulation." Hashtags flipped in real time. Free speech warrior morphed into selective speech. Then came the meme tsunami. Jordan's face next to a loading bar labeled "Integrity 6%, or a screenshot of his quote about digital dictatorships overlaid with his own emails asking to nuke threads. But the knockout came from within. An anonymous staffer from the House Judiciary Committee, previously loyal to Jordan, leaked a series of internal communications. In one, Jordan complained privately that allowing Crockett to speak uncut and unchallenged would invite chaos. In another, dated just 3 weeks before the hearing, he wrote, "Get someone to flag her background. Anything she ever said about vaccine mandates, race, anything. I want her credibility in pieces before she opens her mouth." The email was titled "Containment Strategy." The hypocrisy hit like a slap. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened with a cold smile. So the man screaming about censorship had an actual containment strategy for a sitting congresswoman. How ironic. How American. Over on Fox News, even Laura Ingraham shifted. She didn't defend Jordan. She changed the subject. Tucker Carlson was silent altogether. But it wasn't just the pundits. It was the people. In Ohio, Jordan's home state, college students at Ohio State marched with signs reading, "You can't censor truth," and "End algorithm manipulation. Start with Congress." Local radio stations played Crockett's voice on loop. A bar in Columbus renamed one of its drinks the Jasmine Slammer. Even conservative-leaning constituents began to voice unease. A Vietnam vet called into a local station and said, "Look, I voted for Jordan, but if the man can't tell the difference between protecting speech and rigging it, maybe he shouldn't be anywhere near a gavel." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett held no press conference. She didn't need to. Her closing line had done more damage than 1,000 op-eds. Freedom that needs to hide is not freedom. It's fear in a costume. Within 48 hours, the House Ethics Committee received over 3,000 formal complaints requesting an inquiry into Jordan's influence on media platforms. A former member of YouTube's public policy team testified anonymously to The Guardian. "Before every high-profile hearing, we got pressure to delist anything critical of Jordan. Not directly, but it was always clear what was expected. They used buzzwords like election climate and timing sensitivity. But it was control. Always control." The dominoes fell faster than expected. Fox News producers released an internal memo showing that a scheduled segment investigating pharmaceutical lobbying and its ties to Jordan's donors had been pulled last minute, allegedly after external pressure. The anchor who'd written the piece, now freelance, posted a video. "I was told we can't afford to destabilize the Jordan wing of the party. That's not journalism, that's PR. By week's end, Jim Jordan's brand was no longer Fighter for Liberty. It was King of the Back Channel. Polls showed a 17-point drop in favorability among independent voters. His approval among younger Republicans, aged 18 to 30, plummeted. A viral Reddit post summarized it all with brutal precision. Turns out Jordan doesn't hate censorship. He just hates when it's not aimed at his enemies. At an emergency donor summit in Texas, one of Jordan's top financial backers reportedly slammed a folder shut and said, "You didn't lose because of liberals. You lost because of mirrors. Even fellow Republicans began to distance themselves. Senator Rand Paul issued a cryptic tweet: "Transparency is not a partisan issue. It's the foundation of trust." Others were less subtle. Liz Cheney, long estranged from her party's far right, tweeted a single word with a link to the signal screenshots: "Exposed." And Jasmine? She remained silent in public, but her silence said more than words. That silence was interpreted as victory. The image that dominated Sunday morning shows wasn't Jordan pounding a table. It was Jasmine Crockett, holding up a blood-red folder, eyes locked on her opponent, as if staring not at a man, but at a system cracking. In classrooms, students debated the limits of freedom. In newsrooms, editors recalibrated their definitions of bias. And in living rooms across America, ordinary citizens who'd once dismissed the hearing as just another partisan spat now asked the question Jasmine had posed so quietly, so fatally: do you want to protect freedom, or just your version of the lie? And yet, in that silence after the final accusation, something deeper than scandal began to take root. A national realization that this wasn't just about one man, but about what the country was willing to accept in the name of convenience. In the days that followed, the headlines blared and the hashtags surged. But beneath the noise, something quieter and more lasting took shape. For the first time in years, Americans weren't just arguing about censorship. They were questioning their own assumptions about it. Free speech, a phrase that had once united, now revealed its fractures. Crockett's voice had cut through the noise like a scalpel, exposing not just Jordan's hypocrisy, but a system that had made selective truth a political currency. And as citizens watched the replay, frame by frame, they didn't just see one man squirm. They saw a reflection of how easily power twists the very ideals it claims to protect. In classrooms and courtrooms, coffee shops and congressional offices, the fallout took shape, not with outrage, but with introspection. Parents talked to their kids about algorithms. Editors reviewed old stories. Activists began tracing the digital footprints of deleted posts, trying to understand just how deep the manipulation ran. This wasn't just about Twitter or Signal. It was about control, about who gets to shape the narrative before it even reaches the public eye. And suddenly, the illusion cracked. People stopped assuming that more voices meant more truth, because now they had seen how one well-placed email, one quiet phone call, one veiled suggestion could silence thousands. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment was more than vindication. It was a warning shot. She hadn't walked into that hearing to destroy a man. She had walked in to defend an idea. The idea that truth, even when messy, even when inconvenient, must never answer to political comfort. And that courage was not loudness, it was persistence. She stood in that room, unwavering, not because she relished the fight, but because she understood the cost of losing it. Her line, "You're not afraid of censorship. You're afraid when it stops protecting you," didn't just sting, it echoed. It challenged everyone listening to ask, when do I stay silent, and why? The lesson landed not in Capitol Hill press briefings, but in everyday conversations. A young teacher in Ohio re-added a banned article to his curriculum. A tech worker in Seattle leaked moderation memos to the press. A small-town librarian refused to pull a book on digital propaganda, citing Crockett's hearing as precedent. The ripple wasn't loud, but it was relentless. Because once you see the strings, you can't unsee the puppet show. And America had just watched the curtain pulled back by a woman who refused to blink. What made it unforgettable was the absence of theatrics. Crockett didn't yell. She didn't storm out. She wielded truth like a blade honed by restraint. And when she said, "Real freedom doesn't need to hide a single line," it wasn't a slogan. It was a challenge. To Jordan, yes, but also to every person who ever whispered about integrity but went quiet when it was no longer useful. The final blow wasn't the leaked emails or the hidden video. It was the realization that the man screaming about being silenced had spent years deciding who else should never be heard. He had wrapped censorship in patriotism. He had blurred influence with intimidation. And the public, once fooled, now watched with eyes wide open. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about a hearing. It was a story about a nation deciding what kind of speech it truly values. The kind that flatters, or the kind that dares. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't just survive the moment. She redefined it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.